one. Sorry, I just got cut off there. Just a few more things to say about this little argument, which turns out to be much more complex. That's the thing. I mean, once we start actually being careful, and certainly this course in part is just an exercise in being careful. Once we start being careful about things, it turns out there's a lot more complexity there than we might have noticed on a first reading. But just a final couple remarks. We're just analyzing this argument and then evaluating it. Is it a good argument? Does it actually support well its final overall conclusion? Well, first of all, let me just say one thing. When we analyze an argument, when we evaluate an argument, we're evaluating an argument. That is, we're evaluating how well the premises actually support the conclusion in terms of validity, and we're evaluating whether the premises themselves are true. That is, we're evaluating the soundness of the argument. Does it have true premises, and does it actually imply? Is it valid? So soundness being those two things, we're evaluating the soundness of the argument. We are not simply evaluating the truth or falsity of the conclusion, because it could be that we have a bad argument. It could be that this is a terrible argument, but it could be that this conclusion is still true for other reasons, right? So if say we decided this argument was a really terrible argument, then what we would be determining was that the argument wasn't sound for one reason or another, but we wouldn't be dismissing the conclusion. That is, it could be that the conclusion is true, but it's just simply not supported for the reasons that are given, but that there are other reasons to believe it's true. So when we evaluate the soundness of an argument, that's exactly what we're doing. We're evaluating the soundness of an argument, not necessarily the truth of its conclusion. But about this argument, well, I mean, it's a matter of judgment. A course in critical thinking does not give you a foolproof method for determining whether an argument is good or bad. What it gives you, I think, is a little help in putting yourself in a position to be able to judge it better, to use your own judgment. Ultimately, for instance, knowing what the premises are and what the conclusions are is good for us because, what is unsupported here? That, right? Is that true? What is unsupported here? That. Is that true? If it's not, then the argument is not a good argument. If it is, then the argument has some hope. By drawing these horizontal lines, I hope I didn't destroy that. By drawing these horizontal lines, each of these, of course, remember, stands for an inference. This horizontal line between these two first statements means that the second is a conclusion based upon the first, that an inference is made. Does the conclusion actually follow from the premise? There. Does this conclusion actually follow from this premise? There. Does this conclusion actually follow from these premises? There. Do these two intermediate conclusions, which are the major reasons the war was unjust and the outcome of the war was a disaster, do they really provide strong support for, do they really imply this? Sometimes I think that it's fairly easy. That is, here, if it's true that the Iraq War was a war of aggression, it's certainly true that the war was unjust, because it's kind of analytic, right? If something is a war of aggression, that means necessarily it's unjust, so it kind of helps. But here we saw that, at least I had a question. I mean, it's a pretty good reason to think that a war is a war of aggression if you started without being attacked, but are all wars that you start without being attacked unjust or wars of aggression? I'm not ready to pull the trigger on that, so to speak. I'm not. I'd have to think about it. Do these reasons give you a good reason to believe that this is true? I think so, but then the question is, well, we know this is true, but is this exactly true, or is it exaggerated? Is this true at all? So there'd be a lot of contention there. There'd be a lot of disagreement there. So it's not really clear that this, especially that this intermediate conclusion is well supported. But at the end of the day, what we're asking ourselves is whether this overall conclusion is well supported. That is, whether the premises for it are true, and whether the reasoning from those premises that leads to this is valid. If the premises are true and the reasoning is valid, then the conclusion is true. Pretty much. I mean, not in this sort of absolute deductive way, but if we're saying we have true premises and we're saying that the reasoning from those premises to the conclusions here is valid, then we're pretty much committing ourselves to the truth of the conclusion. I'm not going to say whether that conclusion is true. I would say that that the reasoning is valid, that if this is true and this is true, then it's got to be the case, more or less, that this is true. But as we say, the question is it asking, is this true? Well, is this true? And is this true? So I don't know. Judging it is certainly not a bad argument. It's got some compelling aspects to it. Does it really prove sufficiently its conclusion? Well, that is a matter of judgment and further thought.